Higher U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminium, and tensions continue between Washington and Europe over levies and trade. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Trump administration has increased tariffs on steel and aluminium that have jumped to 50%. The increased levies are likely to hit exporters like Canada and Mexico hard, and they will also have an impact in the European Union, where tensions over tariffs and trade with the United States are already high. We begin with this report from CGTN's Owen Fairclough.
US consumers are already facing soaring vehicle prices this summer due to tariffs, and they're about to rise even more. President Donald Trump's doubling of 25% protectionist duties on imported aluminium and steel taking effect this Wednesday. Those duties are worldwide, with some exceptions. The biggest exporters to the US and those most impacted include Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, the latter baffled by Trump's rationale.
We are exporting highly specialized steel, which is needed for U.S. industry because it's used for specialized production. And we clearly have the same challenge. We are suffering because of the global overcapacity.
Around a quarter of all steel used in the US is imported, so these latest tariffs aimed at safeguarding domestic manufacturing reach far beyond the auto industry. But US steel workers aren't complaining.
The best and strongest steel on earth will forever be made in America and made in Pennsylvania.
Trump visited their heartland last week to announce these tariffs and offer a Japanese investment lifeline to a sector eroded partly by cheaper steel imports. These tariffs took effect on the same day the Trump administration set a deadline for trade partners to submit their proposals for revised deals aimed at scaling back duties. And if many partners are both shaken and stirred by this latest escalation in a trade war, at least 007's favoured car brand Aston Martin has had an escape of sorts. The iconic car maker's native UK allowed to pay merely the original 25% duty on its steel exports, and hoping to pay even lower duties on all exports to the US once a bilateral trade deal is finalised. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
To discuss all of this, joining me now here in the studio is Klaus Lares. He is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Also with us from New York is Anthony Chan. He is a former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase & Company. Joining the discussion too from Brussels is Pieter Klepe. He is editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport-EU. And also with us here in the studio is Joel Rubin. He is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for House Affairs. Welcome to all of you. Klaus Lares, let's start with this increased U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminium now, as I said, up to 50%. This must be of some concern in Germany because Germany does export steel to the United States. In fact, Chancellor Friedrich Merz is in town right now. He will be holding talks at the White House. What are expectations?
Well, the Europeans were shocked. They were outraged by that sudden increase from 25%, as it was until then, already quite high, to 50%. And Trump seems to have made that remark about the increase of the steel tariffs kind of spontaneously during a speech in Pittsburgh. So the Europeans, including the Germans, are deeply worried. They also fear that a lot of other countries who now can't export to the United States anymore will dump their steel on European markets. The European Union is currently negotiating a new trade deal with the Trump administration, and they have said they want to do that trade deal first or negotiate further. They will not immediately retaliate because there's a lot of calls in Europe to retaliate immediately.
Right. But in a sense, Klaus, is Trump getting what he wants? Because, you know, he said when he announced these tariffs, they are going to be coming to Washington asking for talks, asking to make deals. Isn't that what Friedrich Merz is here doing?
I don't think so. Friedrich Merz is a new chancellor, and usually a new leader of government comes to Washington as a courtesy call to get to know the President of the United States. And regarding steel and other trade issues, that is actually the prerogative of the European Union. So the trade representative of the European Union, he will actually negotiate. Merz may negotiate a little bit for his own country, but he can't deal with steel issues as such. And he has his hands full to talk about Germany with Trump.
Right. Anthony Chan, good to see you, Anthony. U.S. allies, including Canada and Europe, Canada and Europe, they're not happy with these tariffs on steel and aluminium as well, which have now doubled, in fact. The increased tariffs also raising concerns among automakers, plane manufacturers as well. I mean, how is this going to affect the U.S. economy?
It certainly is not a positive for the entire U.S. economy, because this will mean that it's going to increase prices for the downstream industries. And there, as you hinted on, is the auto industry, the manufacturing industry that uses steel, and of course the construction industry. So in Europe, you have the major countries that export steel, like Germany, as you alluded to before, Italy, Sweden, and the Netherlands. They're going to face some challenges, because remember that now the prices of their product is higher, so they may be lower demand. And the only people that are smiling, of course, are the steel workers and the aluminum workers. But studies have shown that even though those jobs perhaps are more protected, or we maybe even create some jobs, not many, but some, but that the cost is somewhere between 600,000 to 900,000 costs per job that is saved because of tariffs. So this is certainly not an optimal strategy, but it is a good political move for the president as he sees it.
Joel Rubin, let's talk about the United States neighbors, North and South. Canada is the largest supplier of steel and aluminium to the United States. Mexico is also a very big supplier. Now, the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, he has called these tariffs illegal. And the Mexican President, Claudia Sheinbaum, she says there's going to be countermeasures coming. She's threatening countermeasures. I mean, relations with these two neighbors are already bad. Is it going to get a lot worse?
Yeah, Anand, this is a continuation of the war on the global economy. Clearly, the United States under Donald Trump wants to have an economic war with Canada and Mexico and sort of readjust the terms of the trade deals that we've negotiated, including him. But I think also, and this goes to what Anthony was saying a moment ago, there's a goal here politically, which is to try to get inshoring of these industries, to block Mexico, to block Canada. It may hurt their economies, but from a Trump perspective, that means that they'll basically be out of the American market. And we already see some foreign investment coming in more aggressively to purchase steel industries, just like in Pittsburgh, which is my hometown, where U.S. Steel was for, God knows, maybe a century. Now it's basically Japan Steel, but it's going to provide jobs here in the United States and produce here in the United States that steel without those tariffs. So it could have very serious impacts on Mexico and Canada, but clearly, to Anthony's point, it does rev up the base here in the United States.
But this reshoring effort by Trump, that's a long-term goal.
It's a long-term goal. Yeah. And the displacement costs in the near term, this adjustment period, could be significant. And we're also witnessing at the same time cuts to significant parts of the American government and our expenditures that help train and transition workers, that help smooth out the rough edges of a hard transition. So I think we're in for rocky waters here as well.
Pieter Kleppe, the U.S. tariff increases come as the European Union and the United States are engaged in trade talks. Negotiators have been meeting in Paris, in France. They've been optimistic about the initial meetings, but the European Commission also said it would take countermeasures as well. I mean, what are some of the key areas of contention between the U.S. and the EU?
Where to start? Well, first of all, the dispute on Trump's aluminium and steel tariffs goes back to the first term of Trump. And actually, when Trump announced his April 2nd tariff measures, About a week later, the EU imposed counter tariffs, not in response to the April 2nd measures, but in response to the Trump and the steel and aluminum tariffs from the first term of Trump. Pretty quickly after that, the EU suspended that again because it was getting a little too confusing, and they didn't want to give the impression that they were retaliating against the new tariffs. And that's, I think, quite telling. The EU is basically very afraid to retaliate against the United States. It's clear that there will be they will hold off at least until after the NATO summit in June. I mean, of course, certainly with Trump, all these discussions on NATO, on increasing defense spending and defense capacity and trade, all of these things are mixed up together. Now, a major contention from the United States are the non-tariff barriers that the European Union is imposing. Trump isn't that interested in lower tariffs for coming from Europe. I mean, that's nice to have, but he's mostly concerned about the non-tariff protectionism that the EU has been, engaged in for decades. Well, the United States as well, to be clear. And specifically in the last 5 years, the EU has come up with lots of green protectionism, all kinds of new green bureaucracy for foreign companies to do business in Europe, and those are also considered to be non-tariff barriers by USTR.
Klaus, President Trump has been very tough in his comments about the EU. I mean, let's listen to some of what he had to say.
I've been saying to everybody, they've treated us very badly over the years. It was formed in order to hurt the United States, in order to take advantage of the United States, and they've done that. We have a big deficit with them. They sell millions and millions of cars, as you know, Mercedes and BMW and Volkswagen and many others, and we were restricted from, essentially restricted from selling cars into the European Union, which is not nice.
So there we have Trump saying that, German companies, auto companies in Germany, other European companies have been taking advantage of the United States. It's something that we've been hearing for a very long time. It's one of his recurring themes. It's part of his campaign stump speech, isn't it? But what's the European perspective?
What is really puzzling is that Trump is so hostile, at least on trade, but also in many other issues on Europe, because Europe has been for decades the closest partner of the United States. The trade relationship between Europe and the United States is by far the most important trade relationship and investment relationship in the world. And of course, there's NATO, there's all other sorts of cultural connections. And it is really puzzling why Trump has become so hostile to Europe. When you go a little bit back in history, then it was actually the United States which pushed the Germans and the French together in the 1950s and said, set up a European community to overcome your enmities, to prevent another world war. That was the United States. They were the driver, and now Trump goes around and says, well, now they are the foe. And I think that can only be explained that, well, the Europeans have grown up, they have perhaps from a teenager become an adult and are now competing with the United States. But they are a serious trade competitor. But in all other relationships like security or superpower status, nuclear weapons, Europe is of course not a serious competitor to the United States. So in a way, I think it is very difficult to explain why Trump has that bee under his bonnet regarding Europe. Regarding other countries, for example, Russia, which really is a foe and an enemy to the United States, is much more benign, much softer on Putin than he was in the past on Angela Merkel, for example.
Joel, what's your view? Why does Trump have a problem with Europe?
He's always disliked Europe. He's always disliked alliances. Trump has an aversion to the multilateral cooperation that has benefited the United States for decades. And quite frankly, I think he'd like to see it broken up. And he certainly, right now, is taking aggressive actions, including in the reorganization of the State Department, to put forward policies that favor far-right political parties inside of Europe, many of whom are opposed to European unity and who are supportive of Russia.
And Trump is, of course, from Europe himself.
That's
His
right.
grandfather is German.
German,
you know?
that's right.
So he
yeah.
should actually be supportive of
Well,
Europe.
he lost his citizenship in Germany and was booted out. So there is that.
Okay. Anthony Chan, I want to talk a little bit about trade between the EU and the United States. But first, I want to get your opinion on something we were talking about a moment ago, and that is, what Joel was talking about, and that is reshoring industry, jobs here to the United States. I mean, as we pointed out, it's a long-term goal, it's a political goal, but is it practical?
It is a long-term goal, but it is not practical. And the reason for that is that many of these industries are producing overseas and we're buying them because they have comparative advantage. For example, when you look at aluminum, aluminum is produced in Canada because the cost of producing the aluminum is a lot cheaper in Canada because of the energy prices and the proximity of the mines and things like that. And here in the United States, it would cost more. So yes, we can try to produce more in the United States, but it's going to come at a much, much higher cost, and we're going to lose that comparative advantage with regard to cars. You got to remember that one of the reasons why we started these supply chains that took over 30 years to produce was simply because we wanted to be able to sell U.S. cars that were competitive with cars overseas. So if you basically outsource and you use parts from other areas, steel and auto parts, you can actually produce cars in the United States that can compete with cars in Europe or cars in Japan. But if you start to increase the cost, you go back to where you were in the 1980s, when the U.S. was completely losing any comparative advantage or any competitive advantage with regard to international production of autos.
Right. So let's look at this trade relationship, Anthony, between the U.S. and the EU. Now, that was worth $1 trillion in 2024, but Trump is not happy because the United States is running a trade deficit. I mean, how important is this relationship in terms of trade, and does Trump have a fair point on the deficit?
No, I don't think so, because first of all, he's focusing on the deficit with goods. If you look at the trade deficit with Europe with regard to services, the picture changes. There, we certainly have a comparative advantage with regard to services. This is something that should be brought up in the negotiations. It's not just only about goods. You got to look at services also. Of course, with the sentiment being as dire as it is, the perception of America and Europe, you're starting to see Europeans and Canadians coming less to the United States. Travel or tourism is almost 10% of U.S. GDP, and that's starting to suffer. So you can't look at just one aspect of trade. You really have to look at both goods and services, and we're not doing that.
Right. Joel, Vice President J.D. Vance, he's also been very tough on Europe, and Europeans have expressed increasing concern over the broader relationship between Europe and the United States. I mean, is there a risk that these trade tensions that we're seeing right now could undermine the broader relationship?
Well, without a doubt, they're creating major frictions. Look, the United States is not going into these as a negotiator in good faith. What the president is doing is taking unilateral actions against, in many instances, our best allies and our best friends, as we've been discussing. And so how does that improve a relationship? How does that create win-win outcomes? It really doesn't. And it creates discord. But not only that, it loses confidence. And what you hear now around the world is that governments overseas, consumers overseas, they're losing confidence in the United States as a reliable trading partner. And that confidence, that you can't buy. That's not something you just get back overnight once the deal is done. And especially not with a president like this. And it's worth mentioning, Donald Trump, he's taking actions that have been deemed illegal by trade courts in the United States. Those judgments are on hold for now. They're under appeal. But these are actions that Congress has a major role to play in, and he's not following the law. He's not going to Congress about it. So he's really upending the system. And for our partners, they don't sleep well at night, not knowing what the future will bring, and that really risks these relationships.
Yeah, in fact, Klaus.
I would fully agree with that. Nothing could go further than the trade relationship. Think of the attack on the University universities in the United States by the Trump administration, the stopping of visa interviews for prospective students. People are worried, researchers are worried whether they can actually leave the country, whether they'll be able to come back. This clearly discourages future generations of students and researchers to come and consider the United States as their future home. So it will have long-lasting, very negative consequences for the United States. And what was said before, for the Europeans, trade and Ukraine and NATO and defense are very different and separate issues, but not for the Trump administration. And that makes it even more unpredictable and more uncertain than it would otherwise be.
Pieter Kleppe, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she was very critical of the Trump tariffs when they were announced in April. Let's listen to some of what she had to say at that time.
President Trump's announcement of universal tariffs on the whole world, including the European Union, is a major blow to the world economy. I deeply regret this choice. Let's be clear-eyed about the immense consequences. The global economy will massively suffer. Uncertainty will spiral and trigger the rise of further protectionism. The consequences will be dire for millions of people around the globe.
So, Pieter, von der Leyen did talk with Donald Trump at the end of last month, and she described that as a quote-unquote good call. But what is the case that she can make for the EU? I mean, what kind of leverage does the EU have?
I think both sides can hurt each other quite badly. The difference being that for the United States, this, the leverage they have is not just trade, it's also defense. So I think, in effect, the US has, of course, the upper hand here in these negotiations. What we can see is that Trump, he increased these tariffs now on steel and aluminium, but he's very much in favor of making a deal. So we can see quite a bit of flexibility also vis-a-vis other trading partners. There is already a deal with the United Kingdom. So, I mean, whether that's right or wrong, this relatively optimistic take, it is also what the markets seem to believe. The markets have done relatively well over the last month. Also, a little bit under the radar is how the EU has made an important concession on its deforestation regulations. So it has basically classified, US products as low risk, which effectively means that for them, the new green bureaucracy, the non-tariff barriers will effectively have been reduced quite a lot. And this is opposed to countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia. They are big importers of palm oil into the West. And they say, well, NGOs say that we have a lot lower deforestation and still you only classify us as medium risk. So, I mean, I think that's a good example of how, Trump has already secured under the radar some concessions from the EU. And I would think more is to come. But even if the EU will not make concessions, which I think would be unwise, even then I would be relatively optimistic. It looks like Trump is wary to really bite. They have named him Taco Trump to make fun of him. I mean, those things are really important to him. And at least during his first term, he was definitely always open for a deal.
Okay, Anthony Chan, the OECD released a report this week. It downgraded its economic growth forecasts for the United States and for the global economy. It cited tariffs and economic uncertainty. I mean, how are these tariffs going to affect global growth?
Well, there's no question that tariffs slow down economic growth because as prices go up, then consumers have to end up consuming less because they pay more for these goods that face a higher tax. And that's why the OECD, as you hinted, lowered their forecast. They lowered their forecast from 3.1% for 2025 to 2.9%. And for next year, 2026, they lowered the global economic forecast to 2.9% also from 3%. And of course, bringing down the U.S. economic growth forecast down to 1.6%. Keep in mind that last year the U.S. economy grew at 2.8%. So that's a significant drop for the United States. And it's not just the OECD. If you look at the IMF, they put out some estimates about all the countries and how they're going to be negatively impacted from a potential trade war. And the U.S. is leading the pack. Even China is going to suffer, but not as much as the United States. The expectation is that economic growth in the U.S. because of a trade war actually suffers. And then finally, Anand, even the Congressional Budget Office just put out some estimates that suggested that because of these tariffs, more revenues will be collected, but it will have a negative impact on economic growth in the United States, both this year and next year, to the tune of about 0.4%.
Joel, how does all of this fit into domestic politics? You know, when you look at Trump, we were talking about this earlier on, he goes to Pennsylvania, visits a steel mill there, appears in front of thousands of steel workers. I mean, is he trying to curry favor with steel workers in a state like Pennsylvania, which actually helped him win the election? You would know about this. That's where you come from, Steel Town, Pittsburgh.
Oh, yeah.
And is this more about politics than economics?
It's a little of both, and certainly it's about politics. But you know, Donald Trump, he's looking for the unicorn, and he believes he found it. He believes he has the trick with tariffs to get his agenda done. And this is the kind of magic thinking that we see from him. And he often tries to sell this. It works for his base. But as Anthony's describing, it's going to damage the economy and it's going to hurt his voters directly. And politically, the case is going to be made, because it's so early in his term, there's going to be a lot of runway for this. The case is going to be made that Trump's economy and this magic bullet theory of tariffs actually shot you and your economic health instead.
Okay, Klaus, very quickly.
But he will compromise in the end. The EU has suggested 0 tariffs. He probably believes that it is 10%. 10% seems to be the new zero for Trump. And he will claim that he pushed it through, his aggressive policy made it successful. But in the end, I think he will cave in and go much, much lower than what he has done now.
And very quickly, Klaus, the EU represents 27 countries. Are we going to see a visit by Ursula von der Leyen and her trade commissioner to Washington pretty soon?
I don't know, but they should come, definitely, yes. And hopefully they will. Von der Leyen and Trump have had a good telephone conversation. So I guess there's room.
Phone call.
That's right, a very nice phone call. And I guess there's room for a personal meeting, and I think it's about time.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.